A worthless woman
We must
brings
leave
nothing
now.
to a
It's not
marriage
safe
but
here.
expense and disappointment. Her uncle's words still echoed in the sunlit library of Athalgard House as he slid the marriage contract across the polished mahogany table, his fee already tucked into his waistcoat. Clemency Rowe's lack of dowry, her unfortunate habit of reading, her sharp tongue that had driven away 3 potential suitors, these were the reasons he'd sold her to the first titled man willing to overlook what respectable families would not. But when the Duke of Athalgard lifted his gaze from the document to meet her eyes, dark, intelligent, and startlingly direct despite the way she held herself so rigidly still, he saw something that made his hand pause, the quill hovering above the signature line. Fear. Raw, desperate fear that had nothing to do with becoming a duchess and everything to do with the man who'd brought her here. The sound of tearing parchment cut through the silence as he ripped the contract cleanly in half. "Oh, before we step further into this library together, do me a favor, will you? My brother swore this channel would never reach even 500 subscribers. He said stories about quiet women finding their worth were too soft for anyone to care. I think he's wrong. If you're listening right now, wherever you are, curled up in bed, walking the dog, hiding in the office loo, drop a quick comment and tell me where in the world you're hearing this. Hit that like button, tap subscribe, and let's prove him spectacularly wrong together. These stories matter. You matter. Now, back to Clemency. Her uncle lurched forward, his face purpling with rage. "What are you doing?" The words exploded from him as he stared at the ruined document, the ink still wet where the Duke's signature should have been. "I have expenses, Your Grace, the girl's upkeep, the journey here." The Duke of Athalgard rose from his chair with the slow, deliberate movement of a man accustomed to command, his considerable height and the window light behind him turning his golden hair into something almost otherworldly. "You received nothing from me, sir." He gestured to the torn parchment scattered across his desk. "The settlement you anticipated was conditional upon my signature, which I am now declining to provide." She stood near the doorway where her uncle had positioned her like a piece of furniture to be appraised, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Her dark hair was pulled back severely in the manner designed to make her look demure, obedient, valuable. The royal blue gown, chosen to suggest worth she supposedly didn't possess, hung on her slender frame like costume on an actress in the wrong play. She could not have been more than 22, yet she held herself with the weary stillness of someone who had long ago learned that drawing attention meant inviting criticism. Her gaze remained fixed on the floor as it always was in the presence of men negotiating her future, a habit born of too many lectures about unwomanly boldness. But the Duke's eyes found hers again, and she saw something in his gaze that made her breath catch. Not pity, not the calculating assessment of a man purchasing livestock, something altogether more dangerous. Recognition, perhaps, as though he saw past her uncle's words to the person trapped beneath them. Her uncle's hand shot out, gripping her arm with bruising force. "She'll fetch nothing now that you've refused her, Your Grace." His voice took on a wheedling quality that made her stomach turn. "Surely we can renegotiate the terms. Perhaps a smaller settlement would be acceptable given her limitations. No beauty to speak of, no connections, but she's biddable enough when properly managed." The Duke's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the sharp plane of his cheekbone. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, precise, and absolutely final. "Remove your hand from Miss Rowe's arm, now." The silence that followed was suffocating. Her uncle released her as if burned, stumbling back a step. Lucien Valcourt moved around the desk with unhurried grace, positioning himself between Clemency and the man who'd sold her. Sunlight streamed through the window at his back, illuminating him like some figure from a painting, elegant, untouchable, and entirely focused on her. "Miss Rowe," his voice was softer now, but no less commanding, "do you wish to marry me?" The question hung in the air like something fragile and impossible. No one had ever asked Clemency Rowe what she wished. Her throat closed around all the things she couldn't say, that she didn't want to be property, that she was terrified of becoming a burden to another household, that she had nowhere else to go. So she gave him the only truth she could manage, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wish never to return to my uncle's house." Something shifted in his expression, understanding perhaps, or its gentler cousin, acceptance. He nodded once. "Then you won't." They were married that afternoon in Athalgard's private chapel, two strangers bound by necessity rather than affection. Lucian needed a duchess who would manage his household and silence his family's relentless pressure for an heir, but who would never ask for the heart he'd buried with his wife and infant son. Clemency needed safety and a roof that didn't come with daily reminders of her worthlessness. The terms were clear. Separate chambers, separate lives, no expectations of love or intimacy. She accepted without hesitation. He offered without sentiment. Both believed the story ended there, a practical arrangement between two people society had already deemed unworthy of anything more. But what happens when midnight conversations in a candlelit library begin to feel less like obligation and more like coming home? When the man who first saw your fear becomes the one who helps you find your voice? If you've ever wondered whether someone could see your worth before you see it yourself, stay with me. Athalgard rose from the mist-wrapped valley like something from a fever dream. Pale stone towers, endless windows reflecting cold autumn light, gardens that stretched toward horizons Clemency couldn't see. The carriage that delivered her there might as well have crossed into another country. She stood in the entrance hall beneath painted ceilings 3 stories high, her single trunk looking absurdly small beside the marble columns, and understood with perfect clarity that she did not belong here. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hewitt, showed her to the Duchess's apartments in the East Wing with brisk efficiency and eyes that catalogued everything: the provincial cut of Clemency's traveling dress, the absence of a lady's maid, the way she startled at every echo in those vast corridors. "His Grace's rooms are in the West Wing, madam," Mrs. Hewitt said, her tone carefully neutral. "He keeps town hours even in the country. You'll find him accommodating of privacy." Privacy, the word for a marriage that was really a carefully constructed absence. Dinners were served in a dining room built for 20, Lucian at one end of the gleaming expanse of mahogany, Clemency at the other. They spoke of weather, of estate business, of nothing that mattered. He was unfailingly courteous. She was grateful for the distance. It meant she couldn't disappoint him up close. During the day, she met with Mrs. Hewitt, learned the rhythms of a house that employed 37 people, and tried not to hear the whispers that followed her through the servants' corridors. Portionless duchess, no family, married her out of pity, didn't he? She'd been at Athalgard for 2 weeks when sleeplessness drove her from her bed near midnight. The house felt different in darkness, less intimidating, almost gentle. Candlestick in hand, she followed half-remembered directions down silent corridors until she found the library door standing open, warm light spilling across the threshold. She meant to turn back. She should have turned back. But then she saw him. Lucian stood before the far shelves in shirt sleeves and waistcoat, golden hair disheveled as though he'd run his hands through it, absorbed in some leather-bound volume. The candlelight softened the aristocratic severity of his features, revealed the shadows beneath his eyes. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, entirely human. He glanced up. Their eyes met across the candlelit space. Neither spoke, neither moved. And in that suspended moment, Clemency felt something shift, some invisible wall developing its first invisible crack. He didn't look annoyed by her intrusion. He looked relieved, perhaps, as though he too had been alone in this vast house, wandering its rooms like a ghost. "I couldn't sleep," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nor could I." He closed his book slowly, something uncertain crossing his face. "The philosophy section is just there if you'd like." An invitation, the smallest, most careful invitation she'd ever received. Clemency stepped across the threshold and everything changed. They didn't plan to meet again, Yet the next night, when Clemency descended the stairs near midnight, she found him there, same chair, same pool of candlelight, as though he'd been waiting. He looked up, and something like relief flickered across his faces before he schooled them back to careful neutrality. "Wordsworth or Coleridge?" he asked, gesturing to the book in her hand. "Neither. Wollstonecraft." She waited for the familiar disapproval, the tightening around the eyes that meant she'd revealed too much, been too bold. Instead, Lucian smiled, not the polite half-curve he offered at dinner, but something genuine that transformed his entire face. "The Vindication? I have 3 copies. My sister says it's proof of dangerous sympathies." "And what do you say?" "I say your sister has never actually read it." After that, the library became their unspoken agreement. Night after night, insomnia or something kinder drew them to those book-lined walls. They began with safe territory, literary debates, philosophical arguments, the comfortable sparring of 2 minds long starved for intellectual equals. Clemency discovered that beneath his aristocratic reserve, Lucien possessed a fierce, restless intelligence and a passion for ideas that made his voice quicken, his careful composure slip. She also discovered that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be listened to, as though her words mattered. "You're wrong about Hume," she said one night, curled into a wing chair with her feet tucked beneath her nightdress, a casualness that would have horrified her 3 weeks ago. "His argument against miracles doesn't account for—" "For the limitations of empirical observation, yes, I know." Lucien leaned forward, eyes bright with challenge. "But you're assuming testimony can ever be reliable evidence for—" "I'm assuming nothing. I'm saying that the framework itself is flawed if—" They argued until the candles burned low, until her cheeks flushed with the pleasure of being intellectually matched, until she forgot to feel worthless. But then, reaching for a volume on the upper shelf, she stumbled over her own words. "My uncle used to say I'd have been marriageable if I'd just learned to hide how much I'd read, that a woman who thinks too much can never make a man comfortable in his own home." She tried to laugh, to make it light. I suppose he was right about that, at least. The silence that followed felt different, heavier. "Clemency," Lucien's voice was quiet, careful. He set down his book. "Do I seem uncomfortable?" She couldn't look at him. "You're kind, but I know what I am, what I'm worth." "Do you?" Something raw edged into his tone. "Because I spent 3 years believing I was worth nothing, that I'd failed everyone who'd ever depended on me, that I didn't deserve—" He stopped, jaw tightening. "My wife, my son. I wasn't there when the fever came. I was in London attending to trivial matters, while they—" His voice broke. Clemency looked up and saw, finally, the truth she'd missed. He was as convinced of his own worthlessness as she was of hers. "It wasn't your fault," she whispered. "Wasn't it?" His eyes met hers, dark with old pain. "Then why does it feel like it was?" The confession hung between them like something fragile and dangerous. Clemency watched the firelight play across Lucien's features, saw the way grief had carved itself into the lines around his eyes, and recognized it. She'd worn that same weight for years. "My parents died when I was 17. Pneumonia took my mother in winter. My father followed 6 months later. They said it was his heart, but I think it was just broken." She twisted her hands in her lap. "I kept thinking if I'd been better, smarter, less of a burden, if I'd needed less, cost less, maybe he would have had reason enough to stay." "Clemency." "I know it's not rational, but knowing something and believing it are different things, aren't they?" She finally met his gaze. "You know the fever wasn't your fault, but you still feel like you failed them." Lucian's throat worked. "Every day. I see Oliver's face. He was only 2. And I think about all the moments I missed because I was managing parliamentary business that meant nothing. Catherine begged me not to go to London that month. She said the winter had been hard, that Oliver seemed fragile. But I went anyway. I chose wrong." You couldn't have known. I should have. His voice roughened. A father should know. A husband should. He stopped, turning away, and Clemency did something she'd never dared before. She crossed the space between them and laid her hand gently over his, where it gripped the chair arm. His skin was warm beneath her palm, his hand large enough to engulf hers, yet he held perfectly still, as though afraid she might startle and flee. "We carry these ghosts," she whispered. "Yours, mine. Perhaps we're both wrong. Perhaps worth isn't something we lost. Perhaps we just forgot we ever had it." Lucian turned his hand beneath hers, lacing their fingers together with heartbreaking care. The touch was chaste, tentative, but it felt like the most intimate thing Clemency had ever experienced. They sat like that in the firelight, two broken people holding on to each other, and for the first time since her parents died, she felt less alone. "Thank you," he said finally, "for seeing me, for—" The library door swung open with decisive force. "Lucian, I came as soon as I received your letter about the marriage." A woman in an elegant traveling cloak swept in, then froze. Her gaze dropped to their joined hands, and her expression transformed from concern to something colder. "I see." Lucian stood immediately, though he didn't release Clemency's hand. "Beatrice, I didn't expect you until—" "Clearly." Lady Beatrice Ashford's eyes, the same gray-blue as her brother's, raked over Clemency with aristocratic precision. She took in the nightdress barely concealed beneath a wrapper, the bare feet, the informal intimacy of the scene. "Perhaps you should introduce me to your wife." The way she said wife made it sound like an accusation. Lucian's hand tightened around Clemency's, protective and defiant. But Clemency felt the fragile sanctuary they'd built begin to crack, letting in the cold judgment of the world beyond these walls. Lady Beatrice waited until breakfast to begin her campaign. She sat across from Clemency at the too-long table, teacup poised like a weapon, and smiled with surgical precision. "You must understand my concern, Miss— forgive me, Your Grace." The title sounded like mockery. "Lucian has been through such tragedy. He's vulnerable to impulsive decisions. Surely you can see how this marriage appears to those who care for his welfare." Clemency's fingers tightened around her fork. "I assure you, Lady Beatrice, I have no designs on—" "Of course you don't, dear, but society will assume otherwise. A portionless orphan marrying a duke within hours of meeting him? The gossip will be vicious for both of you." The words hit their target. Clemency had heard the servants' whispers, seeing the calculation in Mrs. Hewitt's eyes. She was exactly what Beatrice claimed, worthless, presumptuous, a burden Lucian had taken on out of misguided nobility. "Perhaps," Clemency said quietly, "an annulment would be best." "No!" Lucien's voice cut through the room like a blade. He stood in the doorway, still in riding clothes, jaw set. "Beatrice, a word. Privately." Their voices carried through the study door an hour later, Beatrice's rising in aristocratic outrage, Lucien's remaining dangerously quiet. Clemency shouldn't have listened, but she pressed closer to the paneled wood, heart hammering. "She's a nobody, Lucian. No family, no fortune, no connections. She's my wife. A wife you took in a fit of— what? Guilt? Charity? This isn't like you. You don't make reckless choices." "I made one once." His voice dropped, raw. "I chose parliamentary attendance over my family. I chose duty over presence. I chose wrong, and they died for it. So when I saw that girl standing in my library, terrified, being sold like livestock by a man who'd stolen everything from her, yes, I chose recklessly. I chose to do one thing right." Silence. Then Beatrice, softer. "Lucian,
You didn't see her face, Bea. You didn't see what I saw. Not just fear, recognition. She looked at me like she knew exactly what it meant to be deemed worthless by everyone who should have protected you. And I couldn't, his voice cracked, I couldn't let her uncle take her back to that. Clemency's breath caught. Do you love her? Beatrice asked. De pause stretched unbearably. I don't know what I feel, Lucian said finally, but I know she deserves better than annulment and scandal. She deserves someone who sees her worth, and if no one else will, I will. Clemency stepped back from the door, tears burning her eyes. He'd married her not from pity, but from recognition, because he understood what it meant to carry worthlessness like a stone in your chest, because he'd seen her, truly seen her, and refused to look away. And if you're still here with me, thank you, because if you leave now, you'll miss the moment everything almost falls apart. Please don't go. Hit subscribe so you never miss what happens next. And if you truly won't, come tell me in the comments why this story doesn't deserve your time. I'll be waiting. The letter arrived on heavy legal parchment, delivered by a grim-faced courier who wouldn't meet Clemency's eyes. She read it twice in the morning room, each word landing like a physical blow. Petition for annulment, mental incapacity of the Duke, undue influence exerted by Miss Rowe, marriage contracted under duress and deception. Her uncle had found his revenge. He's claiming I manipulated you. Clemency's voice sounded distant to her own ears as she handed the letter to Lucian. That you weren't in your right mind when you tore up the contract. That I somehow coerced a duke into marriage for financial gain. This is lunacy. Is it? The words escaped before she could stop them. Everyone thinks it. Your sister thinks it. The servants whisper it. A portionless nobody who trapped a grieving duke. It's exactly what society will believe. Then society is wrong. Society never is, Your Grace. It simply is. She turned toward the window, wrapping her arms around herself. Perhaps we should let him have his annulment. You'd be free of this burden, and I could—
Could what? Return to his house. Lucian crossed the room in 3 strides, gripping her shoulders gently but firmly. Let him steal what remains of your inheritance while he parades you before the next buyer. Clemency, look at me. She couldn't. If she looked at him, she'd shatter. Your uncle made a mistake, Lucian continued, his voice taking on an edge she'd never heard before. He assumed I married you in madness and would quietly let him undo it. He didn't account for the fact that I have resources, that I've been investigating him since the day he left Athalgard. That brought her eyes to his. What? Forged letters of proposal, embezzled funds from your father's estate, 3 other young women he's attempted to sell into marriages without their guardian's proper consent. Lucian's jaw tightened. My solicitor has been gathering evidence for weeks. Your uncle is a fraud and a thief, and we can prove it. Hope fluttered painfully in Clemency's chest. But the petition, he's taking this before the House of Lords, before everyone who matters. They'll expect me to defend myself publicly. Yes. Lucian, I can't. Panic clawed up her throat. I've spent my entire life being told to be quiet, to be small, that my thoughts don't matter. You're asking me to stand before the most powerful people in England and tell them they're wrong about me, about us. He cupped her face gently, forcing her to hold his gaze. I'm asking you to tell the truth, not for them, for yourself, for every person who's ever been told they're worthless. His thumb brushed her cheek. I'll be standing beside you, but Clemency, this is your story to tell, and you're the only one who can tell it. Outside, Beatrice was already ordering the carriages prepared for London. The reckoning was coming, whether Clemency was ready or not. Lord Chancellor Pembroke's Mayfair drawing room had been transformed into an impromptu court filled with the kind of people who shaped reputations with a raised eyebrow. Clemency sat rigid beside Lucian, acutely aware of every whisper, every assessing glance. Her uncle stood across the room in borrowed mourning clothes, the picture of wounded dignity. "Your lordships, ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice trembling with practiced emotion, "I come before you not in anger, but in deepest concern for my niece and for his grace the Duke of Athalgard. This marriage, contracted within hours, without proper counsel or family present, can only be explained by temporary derangement brought on by the Duke's tragic losses. I have here testimony from 3 witnesses who will attest that Miss Rowe deliberately sought out the Duke, knowing his vulnerable state." Murmurs rippled through the assembled peers. Clemency felt her courage crumbling, felt herself shrinking back into the invisible girl who'd learned that speaking only brought pain. Then Lucian's hand found hers beneath the table, warm and steady. "Miss Rowe," Lord Pembroke said gravely, "have you anything to say in your defense?" Her throat closed. Every instinct screamed at her to stay silent, to let powerful men decide her fate as they always had. But then she thought of midnight conversations in candlelight, of Lucian's confession about his son, of the way he'd seen her fear and refused to look away. She stood. "My lord, I have evidence." Her voice came out stronger than she dared hope. "My uncle claims concern for my welfare, but concern doesn't steal, it doesn't forge, and it doesn't sell." She opened the folder Lucian's solicitor had prepared, hands steady now. "These are bank records showing systematic embezzlement from my father's estate over 5 years. This is a letter of proposal my uncle claimed came from a baron in Yorkshire. The baron's own testimony confirms he never wrote it. And these," her voice hardened, "are contracts for 3 other young women my uncle attempted to sell without their guardian's legal consent." Her uncle's face went white, then purple. "Lies! She's manipulated you all, just as she manipulated the Duke." "I manipulated no one." Clemency's dark eyes blazed. "His Grace tore up your contract because he saw what you are, a man who views women as commodities, who measures worth in dowries and judges value by silence. You told me my entire life I was worthless, that my thoughts were unwomanly, that I should be grateful anyone would take me. But the only thing I'm grateful for is that the Duke of Athalgard saw me as something more than property." The silence was absolute. Lord Pembroke examined the documents with increasing severity. "Mr. Rowe, these are grave accusations with substantial evidence. I'm denying your petition and referring this matter to the magistrates. Guards, please escort Mr. Rowe from this house." Her uncle's protests faded down the corridor. Society's verdict had shifted, not just about the marriage, but about everything. Clemency's legs nearly gave out. Lucian caught her elbow, steadying her, and when she looked up at him, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath stop. Not relief, not gratitude, wonder, as though he were seeing her truly for the first time, not as someone to protect, but as someone extraordinary in her own right. "Clemency," he whispered, "you were magnificent." Spring came to Athalgard like a benediction. The gardens Clemency had only glimpsed through winter mist now blazed with color. Roses climbing ancient stone walls, lavender bordering gravel paths, cherry blossoms drifting like snow across emerald lawns. The garden party she'd organized drew half the county, their acceptance genuine now that society had vindicated her, their admiration freely given to the Duchess who'd faced down scandal with such devastating eloquence. Beatrice caught Clemency's arm as guests mingled near the fountain. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I judged you before I knew you. I thought you'd taken advantage of my brother's grief, but really, you saved him from drowning in it." Clemency squeezed her hand, then slipped away as the sun began its descent. She found him where she knew he'd be, in their library, standing before the tall windows where light had once haloed him like something otherworldly. Now he simply looked like Lucian, golden-haired, lean, beautiful in his imperfection. "Hiding from your own party?" she asked softly. He turned, and the smile that transformed his face still had the power to steal her breath. "Waiting for you.
I thought we might finally finish our argument about Hume's epistemology. Liar, she crossed to him, emboldened by months of midnight conversations, of hands finding each other in fireplate, of walls coming down brick by careful brick. You hate Hume. I do. His voice dropped, intimate. But I love watching you argue. The way your eyes flash when you're proving a point. The way you forget to be afraid when you're discussing ideas. He reached up, tucking a loose curl behind her ear with heartbreaking tenderness. Clemency, I need to tell you something. I know. Her heart hammered against her ribs. You don't. You can't possibly. He drew shaking breath. That day in this library, when I tore up your uncle's contract, I told myself it was about doing the right thing, about saving someone I recognized as drowning. But the truth is simpler and more terrifying. His hands cupped her face. I saw you, and something in me knew, not that you needed saving, but that perhaps we could save each other. Lucian, I love you. Not the marriage we agreed to, not the convenient arrangement. You, your brilliant mind, your courage, the way you see through my careful control to the broken man beneath. You make me want to be whole again. Tears blurred her vision. I love you too. I think I have since that first night when you looked at me like I mattered, like I was worth something. You are worth everything. He kissed her then, tender and fierce, months of restraint finally breaking. Not because I say so, not because society finally approves, because you chose to believe it yourself. She pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. We're both still broken, you know. Some pieces don't fit back together. No, he agreed, smiling against her lips. But perhaps we're broken in complementary ways. Perhaps we can build something new from the pieces. Outside, the garden party continued without them. Inside their sanctuary of books and candlelight and hard-won truth, two people who'd been told they were worthless chose to believe something better, that worth isn't given by others, but claimed. And sometimes, love is simply two people deciding to be brave enough to be seen. If this story touched you even a little, if it reminded you that your worth isn't decided by anyone else, please don't let it end here. Subscribe now before you forget, so we can walk into the next tale together. And if you won't, come leave a comment and break my heart gently by telling me why. I'll understand, but I'll still hope you'll change your mind. Thank you for staying until the end. Educational value. This story offers layers of meaning that extend far beyond romance into territory that matters deeply for anyone navigating questions of self-worth, power dynamics, and emotional healing. The architecture of self-worth. Clemency and Lucian's journeys illustrate a psychological truth that worthlessness is learned, not inherent. Her uncle's repeated messaging that she was a burden created neural pathways of shame. Lucian's survivor's guilt convinced him he'd failed irredeemably. The story shows how external voices become internalized beliefs, and crucially, how those beliefs can be challenged through being truly seen by another person who reflects back your actual value. Power and consent in historical context. The contract tearing scene isn't just romantic drama, it's a lesson in recognizing coercion. Lucian understood that clemency couldn't give genuine consent under duress, that true partnership requires choice, not transaction. His question, "Do you wish to marry me?" radically reframes their dynamic from commodity exchange to human agency. Shared grief as connection. Their midnight conversations demonstrate that vulnerability isn't weakness, but the foundation of intimacy. Lucian's confession about his son's death and Clemency's admission about feeling she wasn't enough to save her parents show how shared pain, when witnessed without judgment, becomes the bridge between isolated suffering and genuine understanding. Finding your voice.
Clemency's transformation from silent victim to eloquent advocate teaches that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's speaking truth despite terror. Her confrontation of her uncle models how exposing abuse requires both evidence and the willingness to claim your own narrative. Finally, complementary healing. Perhaps most importantly, the story rejects the toxic notion that you must be fixed before deserving love. Instead, it suggests that sometimes two broken people, honest about their fractures, can build something stronger precisely because they understand fragility in themselves and each other.